we'll probably get started.
Okay.
Strictly aesthetic. Gotcha. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Ramesh. I'm a member of the student board of the William F. Buckley Junior Program, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about our program today, introduce our guests, and moderate the debate. Hopefully, everyone is excited. So the mission of the William F. Junior Program is to promote intellectual diversity at Yale University. It is sorely in need. We aim to expand political discourse on campus and expose students to often unvoiced views. We believe that ideas have consequences and that genuine intellectual diversity is essential for advancing critical inquiry and avoiding ideological complacency. Our hope is that by providing a home for a diverse collection of serious conservative thought, we can provide a forum for Yale students to consider and examine a range of political philosophies to which they are rarely exposed. As such, the purpose of this program is to foster open political discussion and intellectual engagement on campus. Today, we will be having a debate on natalism. The resolution, increase the birth rate. For a little bit about our guests, Mr. Ramesh Ponnuru is the editor-in-chief of National Review magazine, a publication that some of you may be familiar with. A leading advocate familiar with all things involving family formation, he is also a prolific writer. Mr. Ponnuru is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies politics and public policy with a particular focus on the future of conservatism. Concurrently, in addition to being the editor-in-chief of National Review magazine, where he has covered national politics and public policy for 25 years, he is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and a contributor to CNN. He is also the author of The Party of Death, The Democrats, The Media, the Courts, and the Disregard for Human Life, and The Mystery of Japanese Growth. On the other hand, we are also joined by Ms. Jill Filipovic, a Brooklyn-based journalist and an author as well. Queens is objectively the better borough, but we won't hold it against her. Some of her books include OK Boomer, Let's Talk, How My Generation Got Left Behind, and The H-Spot, The Feminist Pursuit of Happiness. A weekly columnist for CNN and a 2019 New America Future of War Fellow, she is also a contributing opinion writer to the New York Times and a former columnist for The Guardian. She writes at jill.substack.com, hosts the Week in Woman podcast, and holds writing workshops and retreats around the world. Without further ado, I will now open up the floor to our guests for opening remarks. We can start with Mr. Ponnuru.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. The only thing you forgot to mention is that I am currently serving as the Prime Minister of Great Britain, at least for a few days. Now, thank you very much. Talking about children, need to raise the birth rate. I should confess at the outset that I am biased. Both of my parents were pediatricians, so it's probably genetic. I'm very pro-baby and pro-child, a disposition that survived today's flight up here, where we had a toddler whose lung capacity was better developed than his sense of judgment. But I understand that not everybody feels the same way, and I don't intend to try to convert everybody. I'm well aware that parenting isn't for everybody. So I'm not trying to tell people who don't want to have children that they should have children, or that they should have more children than they want to have. I'm also not going to try to suggest that we need to have any kind of coercion or shaming in order to raise the birth rate. Nor, finally, am I going to try to maintain that we need to go back to the kind of birth rates that the U.S. had decades or hundreds of years ago. In the 1780s, it's estimated every American woman had something like 7 to 8 kids, maybe a little much. If you want to do that, that's fine. What I am going to suggest though, is that our falling birth rate in this country, our below replacement birth rate, is not something that we should be indifferent toward. We shouldn't just say, well, that's just the result of millions and millions of individual choices, and that's therefore okay. It should instead, I think, be a matter of public concern, which doesn't mean that we are entitled to just anything in pursuit of changing it, but means that we ought to be thinking hard about it. It ought to be on our agenda, at least to think through what we might do about this. And I think this is for a few reasons. Some of those reasons are geopolitical. Some of them are economic. So anybody who studies Social Security and Medicare, for example, knows that the financing of these two extremely important programs depends on a rising population, depends on people having kids, and the finances are put into serious trouble when that doesn't happen. And so even people who don't have kids or don't want to have kids rely on other people having kids and need to be concerned about this overall trend in the birth rate. But beyond the geopolitics and the economics, there's another reason that's a little bit more maybe simple-minded that I think is the fundamental reason we should be concerned about it. And that is, it's not just that the birth rate is falling to record levels, is that the gap between what people say they want in terms of the number of children and what they're actually having has grown to record levels. For several decades now, since at least the early 1980s, it has been the case that surveys show most people want more kids than they end up having. And even if you go on and do surveys, that's true if you do surveys, if you compare what people end up having to what they say in their early 20s about the number of kids that they want to have. It's true if you go back into people's 40s and ask them how many kids did you have and how many kids would you have liked to have. At present, the number of people who say that they would have liked to have more kids is more than twice as high as the number of people who say that they would have preferred to have fewer kids. So I think we need to consider the reasons why we've had this kind of undershoot. It could be reasons having to do with culture, reasons having to do with economics, reasons having to do with government policy, having to do with corporate policy. But we need to, I think, identify the impediments that have kept people from achieving what they want to achieve in this area that's actually pretty important, not just for the life of society, but for individual happiness. So, for example, we might consider deregulating housing to make it easier to build housing because that seems to be one of the economic constraints that keeps people from being able to combine the number of kids they want with actually being able to live somewhere where opportunities are growing in terms of the job market. Places like San Francisco, San Jose, the New York City area, where those regulations are pretty onerous. We might want to consider things like expanding the child tax credit, something that I've been a proponent of for now almost 20 years. Not with the idea that you are trying to bribe people into having more kids than they want to have, but that you are trying to enable people to do something that they already want to do. It seems to be there are all kinds of things that we think about when we're determining what our society and our government ought to do. We want a higher GDP. We want a lower poverty rate. We want cleaner air and water. These are all things that we want for various reasons, but one of the most basic ones is people like these things. People want them. People like material things. That's why we want GDP growth. People don't like being in poverty and have good reasons for not liking that. Well, people also would like to have more kids, and if there are things that are systematically frustrating that ambition, we ought to be tackling that. We ought to put that on the agenda, and we shouldn't allow various kind of intellectual confusions to keep us from doing that. So I'm standing not only for children, but for happiness, but I'm happy to let Jill take the con side of those things.
So I'm probably going to disappoint all of you when I tell you that I'm actually not here to present the side of the anti-natalist. I am not against baby having. If Yale wanted to hear from somebody who thinks no one should have babies, they probably should have invited somebody else. I apologize. What I am here to say is that this frame, natalism versus antinatalism, is just not how we should be considering the question of whether women should have more babies, which women should have more babies, how many more babies women should have. The question of reproduction shouldn't be one of national utility, but rather one of the good of individuals and of individual freedom, and also purpose, connection, pleasure, meaning. When it comes to reproduction, governments should aim to maximize autonomy and family well-being, not push families to have more children, but rather make sure that citizens are supported, healthy, and cared for, and can make a wide range of reproductive choices. And pronatalist policies may be a part of that. But the goal shouldn't be more babies. It should be healthier families and more women and men who are able to choose what their family structure looks like. And the good news is that if governments do that, there are a number of families and individuals who will choose to have children. Reproductive choice, after all, includes the choice to have kids and also the ability to parent those children in health and safety. And that choice is, as Ramesh says, one that too many families struggle with. He's right. There is research that millennial women in particular are not having as many children as they say they want. We also know to some degree why. Women are telling us. They're saying it's mostly a matter of time and money. They don't have enough money to pay for childcare, don't have enough money to live in the kind of cities that now young working people have all kind of coalesced around, and don't have the time that they want to dedicate to their children. Parenting has gotten more intensive at the same time as the workplace has gotten more intensive, and all of it has gotten more costly. Solving this problem, giving families more time and more money, is one place where pronatalists and feminists could find some common cause. Most progressives and most feminists certainly support things like more generous benefits for families, including universal childcare, several months of paid parental leave for new mothers and new fathers, reasonable limitations on working hours, and even baby bonuses. I can't speak for every Democrat or progressive, but I certainly support a robust welfare state that ensures no child lives in poverty, and that families are even handed cash and given significant tax breaks for each child that they have. Unfortunately, it's conservative politicians who are often standing in the way of these measures. Here's the truth, though. All of the child benefits in the world are not going to take us back to a time when women were having an average of 4 or 5 or 6 children apiece. No developed country, even those with the most generous benefits on God's green earth, have figured out a way to do that. Where women have very large numbers of children, it is almost universally in nations that are still developing, where lack of access to health care is very, very far from universal, where women often have fewer rights and certainly poorer access to health care, where fewer women are in the paid workforce, and where women and children alike have far poorer health outcomes, including much higher rates of maternal and child deaths. So in other words, there is some evidence that pronatalists can achieve pretty modest increases in birth rates through a more generous welfare state. But the only way that pronatalists are going to see significant upticks in birth rates is through force or coercion, criminalizing abortion, outlawing contraception or making it really hard to get, and constraining women's professional opportunities and women's rights more broadly. That's too high a price to pay for more babies. Pronatalists raise important questions about how to sustain the social safety net, economic growth, creative works, and entrepreneurship without a critical mass of young people. One solution here is forcing and coercing women to have more babies, but there's another option, and it's immigration. The world doesn't necessarily need more people, and there is a legitimate question of whether the world can even sustain more people. Immigration is a win-win. More workers in pursuit of better lives can enter the US, and the American economy and our social security coffers enjoy a significant windfall. Purported natalist goals can be solved largely by immigration, unless the goal isn't simply more workers and more children and more economic growth, but more babies of a particular ethnicity or cultural background. Public policy choices often require serious moral and ethical decision making and an inquiry into which values we place over others. And this is definitely the case when it comes to natalist policies. And so the question is, what are you willing to give and what are you willing to give up in order to increase the birth rate, if that's your goal? There is a way to juice the birth rate without constraining individual liberty through a combination of increased immigration and greater support for families and children. And to do that, conservatives are going to need to be a bit more flexible when it comes to some of their other goals, including decreasing government spending and limiting immigration. But the other option, implementing coercive and forced reproductive policies as a pro-natalist strategy, infringes clearly and directly on what conservatives claim as a key value: individual freedom and the right to pursue one's life on one's own terms. So I think we actually maybe agree more on, probably not on the policy details.
I was prepared for Jill to be reasonable, but I wasn't quite prepared for her to be as reasonable as she's been. I will take up two of the questions that she raised where we do have a disagreement. One is a disagreement that I'd like to bracket off to the extent possible. Now, I don't think it's any secret. I am strongly against abortion and think it should generally be illegal. I don't think that is, I don't believe that in order to raise the birth rate, nor do I think it actually would do much to raise the birth rate. Most of the social science on the legalization of abortion in the US in the late 60s and early 1970s suggests that it didn't do much to reduce the birth rate. And a decline in the abortion rate since 1990 has coincided with a decline in the birth rate. That may seem paradoxical, but there's actually a fair amount of research that suggests, for example, in the late 60s and early 70s, what you really had was not so much a reduction in the birth rate as a big increase in the conception rate, and then abortion more than made up for that increase in the conception rate. But I really think that the ethical issues relating to individual autonomy on the one hand, the right and sanctity of life on the other hand, are in important ways orthogonal to the question of whether we should be generally concerned about the birth rate. Second, on immigration, I think that there are some serious limits to immigration as an answer to this problem that we need to face. First, it does nothing to address the gap, right? Bringing in more people may raise the population, but it doesn't address the problem that people are not having the number of kids that they say that they would like to have. The other problem is that we're going to have increasing global competition for immigrants over time, because it's not just the US that is facing this problem, not just the developed world that is facing this problem. Really, the entire world is at various stages of a demographic transition. China is going to get old before it gets rich. And if we take a lot of people from China, we are simply making their problem worse at the same time that we're making one of our problems or some of our problems better. And then finally, I think the research is pretty convincing, and just sort of casual empiricism is convincing, that the lower the birth rate at home, the less tolerance there is for immigration in the first place. Countries and societies are more likely to feel overwhelmed by an influx of immigration when they're not having kids themselves. And the politics around immigration become much dirtier and uglier than they otherwise would have been. So I'm not even sure that these things really are substitutes that are available to us in practical terms.
Go ahead.
Great. So I think the chief question of this debate is raising the birth rate even an important goal? And I do think that is the key divide between, I mean, among other policy details, which we're clearly on opposite sides of. But in my view, I don't think raising the birth rate needs to be a public policy goal. I'm happy to work in consort politically with people who have that as a goal, right, strategically, that we can kind of all then get some policies that deliver us something we want. I think that is an important space for kind of across the aisle bipartisan negotiation. But this question of should ticking birth rates up be something that politicians prioritize and then structure policy around, I think is a pretty fundamentally dangerous way to approach these questions. When we're talking about raising birth rates, what we're talking about really 99% of the time is women's bodies, right? Not 100%, but most of the time. And I think it is too easy, it has historically been far too easy, to get from that goal of more babies to the means of forcing, coercing, manipulating women's choices, cutting some choices off, and then kind of hurting women in directions that maybe is not in line with what they would choose if they had a kind of wider field in front of them. And so from just a sort of basic policy view, to me, there are a lot of feminist policies, pro-family feminist policies, that there's some evidence that they do help to solve the problem that you identify, which is this gap between what families actually do and what adults say that they want when it comes to family formation. And so it's a bit flummoxing to me that the same folks who often put forward pronatalist views, often but not always conservatives, don't tend to then get in line when it comes to, well, you've got to put some money on the table now, right? If you want to actually solve this problem, if you want people to be able to have the number of children that they say they want to have, then maybe solve the problems they're identifying and why they're not having those children. Instead, what we, I think, often see from the pronatalist side and the conservative side is an attempt to walk back women's rights to put us in a more traditional historical family structure with the hope that that will then, I would argue coercively, push women into having more children rather than giving folks more opportunities, more choices to meet their own purported goals.
Well, I guess
all right. Well, now we're going to transition into moderator questions. I have the privilege of asking the first few, but after that we will transition into audience questions. So I have a few. This one can go to both of you, and we'll start with you, Jill. One interesting country that seems to be anomalous with respect to the trend downwards of birth rates, albeit while it has reduced its overall fertility rate, is Israel. Iran is also kind of weird there, but we're just going to put that aside because of all the other factors at play there. So Israel's birth rate, both from its religious population and its secular population, is far higher than that of other developed communities. I'm curious why the two of you think that might be.
That's a good question, and I'm hesitant to answer it in depth because I don't know a lot of details about Israel's social welfare state and family policies. I think there is some good research that the higher the number of conservative communities in a place, the higher the birth rate. It's one reason the US birth rate is higher than many of our kind of peers, economic peers in Western Europe. I would guess, and you seem to say, that that would have some influence. Again, I sort of hesitate to venture too much of a guess. However, I was just last week in Jordan, in Zaatari refugee camp, doing some reporting on, essentially on reproduction and family planning. And the Syrian refugee population in Jordan has a much higher birth rate than the native Jordanian population. And one question is, why is that? And part of it is that they were from a more conservative, more rural community in Syria before they came to Jordan. But when I was talking to women, what I kind of heard over and over again is, essentially, a lot of us got killed, right? We're being wiped out. We want to make sure that our people, our families, can sustain, that we can kind of recreate these lineages and these lines. And I think there are some pretty clear parallels there, right, to the Jewish experience. And so it makes sense to me that if your people has been a target of genocide and obliteration, that the necessity to have more children, to keep those lines going, to kind of repopulate, to me seems very human and very intuitive and makes sense. So, again, that is like very much just a guess. I don't know the details of Israel, but that to me seems like potentially one component part.
Yeah, I'm going to follow Jill in saying the 3 forbidden words for any political commentator. I don't know. But I suspect that Israel's status as a kind of embattled garrison state has something to do with it. Now, it's tricky because times of extreme social stress are often times where birth rates drop. And drops in birth rates are often signs of that social stress. The 1930s in the United States being an example, Russia after the fall of communism being another example. But I suspect that has a lot to do with it in Israel, that sense of solidarity that has been born from strife.
Yeah, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. Now I'm going to, since both of you took a little bit of a libertarian bend, I'm going to push the paternalist button a little bit. Perhaps not from the perspective of the government necessarily, but maybe society at large. What kind of rhetoric should we have surrounding family size at all as a community? Let's forget about the violent arm of the state, but for example, my grandmother, 13 pregnancies on my dad's side. My grandmother on my mom's side, 1 pregnancy. Very different. There's stark differences across communities. Is there any kind of ideal that cultural outputs should project onto a society? Is there anything that we should be striving to? Is there a healthy number that maybe we should talk about, or is even any discussion of that irrelevant or undesirable? And we can start with you, Ramesh.
Yeah, well, I do think that there are good reasons for government neutrality in these matters. It's harder for a culture to be neutral. Cultures almost inevitably hold up some kinds of ideals and not others. Even there, I would be reluctant to put a strong emphasis on, people need to have a lot of kids. Some people can't, right? Some people try very hard and explore all kinds of options and just have real difficulty, and it's a source of great sadness for them. And I think we should be mindful of that and not increase that pain, which is, I think, particularly acute in certain subcultures where large families are encouraged. By the same token, I do hear from people, and particularly mothers of large families, that they feel, even when they're sort of out and about, that they're constantly being judged, do they not know about birth control? That kind of thing. And I'd like to see us do less of that. So I guess, to be a little touchy-feely here, I would like a little bit more empathy and tolerance on both sides of this. And I do think that the libertarian kind of answer of making it easier for people to pursue their life plans makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree for sure with the idea that government should be neutral on this question of what is an ideal family size. I think anything short of anything in a different direction, whether it's for a large family or for a small family, is pretty dangerous. I do think as a society, we should think about parenting, the decision to bring new beings into the world, as a pretty weighty moral one. That doesn't mean it's immoral to bring children into the world. I also don't think it's inherently moral to bring a child into the world. But I do think that it is important to have complex, empathetic, and hopefully to whatever degree possible, non-judgmental conversations about, first of all, how can we as a society make it easier for people who want to have children to affirmatively make that choice? How can we also make it easier for people who choose not to have children to still find family, community, meaning, purpose, all the things that women in particular have particularly derived from parenthood? I do think it is also worth having a conversation about what happens when women are either forced or coerced to go through multiple pregnancies. It is typically, not universally, but typically not great on the body to have 13 pregnancies, right? There is a reason that when we saw these incredibly high birth rates, we also saw pretty high rates of women dying during pregnancy or childbirth, and very high rates of infants and children also dying early in life. And you see that relationship still, right? So this idea that the judgment kind of only extends to large families and that's the problem, I agree that there's no need to be glaring at the lady at the grocery store with 6 kids. But on the other hand, I think this kind of cultural veneration of large families, the TLC channel shows about, I've never watched any of them, but this kind of not even fascination, but applause that I think that you all often see in the US in religious communities and in Christian communities, which is more kind of my cultural background. I think that there are real downsides to that as well. And we could stand for a more nuanced conversation around the kind of ethics and morals and, I mean, frankly, kind of physical weight of having a large family.
Erin, could I take a quick second bite of the apple? Because, you know, and I'll walk away from the libertarianism that you objected to a little bit there, or at least questioned, which is that, you know, if we were in a society where the ideal family size, where most people said they want to have one child or no children, I might be here arguing, no, you should want something more than that. And there's all kinds of problems with a society that doesn't reproduce itself. But that would be a very different argument, but it would also be a much, much harder argument, right? How do you get people to want something that they don't already want? But that's just not the society that we actually live in. And that's one of the reasons why I'm making the kind of argument that I'm making here.
I guess if I can just, can I add one more thing? Sorry.
Of course.
I think this point about, that you've come back to several times, and I think is an important one to get into, this gap between desire and reality, right? The question of what people want when it comes to something as profound and intimate and life-changing as children and family size, I think it's a lot more complicated that can be captured in a survey. I think these surveys they're useful, right? And I'm glad that you mentioned that they're the surveys that look at what women wanted at 18, right? And then what they ended up having at 45. And that makes sense to me that there would be a gap, right? Like what I wanted at 18 in every single aspect of my life is completely different than it is for me now, 20 years later. But also that when you survey people at 40, that gap, I think, is a smaller gap, but still remains. The question, though, of what it means to want something when you ask that question in a vacuum is very different than the answer to that question in the greater context of one's life. So I wonder how those responses would be different if you were asking somebody at 35, okay, you say that you wanted 3 children, you only have 2, would you have given up your job or your ability to live in this place or your ability to travel or your fraying marriage, or whatever it is, would you have traded that in? And it's very hard to do sociological research on that level. I think the kind of best indicator that we have for what is it that women actually want is what do the women with the most opportunities, resources, ability to make these choices do, right? Women who have the fewest constraints on their lives. And I think when you look at that, what you see is that women say, maybe I want more children, but I also want better childcare. I want more free time. I want a more flexible job. And that group of women overwhelmingly has pursued both having children, but at a lower rate, frankly, than other groups, and has also pursued work in the paid labor force, and has sort of made this a series of overlapping, interconnected life choices, which, through walking through some doors, foreclose others. And so I guess, I feel like I'm sort of rambling now, but what I'm trying to say is that this question of, in an ideal world, if everything had been perfect, how many children would you have had? That doesn't quite capture the landscape of choices, other joys, other desires, other benefits that women decided to reach for instead of that 3rd child.
All right, now I want to take a 3rd bite of the apple.
Can we just stand up here and talk?
No. We can just come back to some of those questions.
Okay, great. And I have one last question for you all, and then we'll transition into audience questions, so get those gears a-turning. But as both of you agree, regardless of what the actual numbers are, both of you seem to think that if men and women want to be having children and they are not having as many children as they are, within the context of their individual lived experiences, that's undesirable. One of the things that's unique about our very particular circumstances today is not only a reduction in the fertility rate, it's even a reduction in fecundity. People are literally less capable of having children. Sterility has increased, general tendencies of infertility, there's a variety of reasons of why this might be. Would either of you support government programs to help ameliorate this problem for those who want to have more children? I'm thinking anything ranging from surrogacy and IVF all the way to programs to combat things like obesity, which seems to also be getting in the way of people's ability to have children?
I mean, for me, yes, it's program specific. I would love to see IVF and things like egg freezing and the whole range of fertility treatments covered under a universal healthcare scheme if we're living in my ideal world. So yes, I think that is a very, very good and important policy. I think general policies to improve the overall health of a society, I don't know that we need to aim those policies at, we're going to improve health so that you can have more babies. I think we can improve health because it's the right thing to do, and it's better to live in a society where people are healthy and able to pursue whatever aspect of life they would like to pursue in healthier bodies, living longer, living lives that are better. Surrogacy, I think, is a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to kind of pause on that one for now. But generally, fertility treatments, yes, and general health, I think is a really important thing for government to cover.
Yeah, I think it depends is the answer. So on things like infertility and so forth, I think one thing that we need to do and presumably are doing is research, because the causes of that decline are not very well understood. And I see no objection to that sort of thing being conducted by the NIH and other similar organizations. For a lot of the other things, I think a campaign against obesity, for example, as with a campaign to increase birth rates or make it easier for people to have kids, you're going to have to have some searching questions about the efficacy of it, right? What is actually going to work here? What kinds of disadvantages will there be? Cost to liberty, and so on and so forth. But I would certainly be open in principle to the idea that there are things government could do. I mean, I'm skeptical of it. Sometimes you hear people say things like, well, we need to reduce our subsidies for high fructose corn syrup, and that will improve the American diet, and so on. I'm all for that. I don't know if it'll actually have that result, but it's probably worth doing anyway.
Right, now we can transition into audience questions. Questions for our guests. Why don't we go all the way over there?
Hopefully can you guys hear me? I
Yes.
can actually talk without using this.
No, we need it for recording purposes.
Oh,
So just talk into it even though it doesn't seem like it's working? Okay. So I am the one who is probably one of the most vocal about fertility issues because I fought it for 5 years. I alone, on my own, before I quit my job to come to Yale as a freshman, made more money than most of my married couple peers. As a combat wounded veteran who is rated for fertility issues, I am not able to receive treatment from the Department of Veterans Affairs because I am unmarried. So when people from certain sides say that they are interested in or want to support families and people having families by policies that were developed in cases like this, where an unmarried person nor a person married to a same-sex couple can receive the same exact treatment and care that are related to service that the rest of our brothers and sisters can, is like a direct indication that no, we're not really about everyone having more children or people having more children or people who want children really having more children. We're really about having certain people having more children.
yeah. Well, I wasn't aware of that policy. It does seem like an outdated, benighted policy that needs to change. Well, we get started about the last administration on a number of fronts. But let me just say in general, because Jill also raised this thing about sort of the stances conservatives take on various policies. Far be it from me to defend everything that conservatives in politics have done on policy grounds, but I would say, we did have nearly every Republican voting for an increase in the child tax credit that was not discriminatory based on marriage or type of relationship. And you have had efforts, not as widespread as I'd like to see them, but growing to expand family leave, again, that are open to all. And so I think that there are some good things that need to be encouraged on this front, while also keeping in mind the concern that you raised.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point. You know, and I think it speaks to something that the reproductive justice movement was created to address, right? Which is that reproductive rights, of course, is about the right to end a pregnancy, the right to prevent a pregnancy, but also the right to have a child, and the right to parent that child in a safe place, and to be able to provide a healthy life for that child, right? So this is kind of like a big picture feminist goal. And I think paying for fertility treatments, no matter what your background, who you're married to, if you are married, what your age is. I mean, you know, at some point if you're 105, maybe that's like not what we're gonna do. But within kind of all those basic like reasonable medical metrics, to me this is a bit of a no-brainer, but I think what you point to is important, and you know, I'm not pointing this at you, but rather the kind of broader sphere of many, although not all, pronatalist conservatives, is that the goal is not necessarily more babies generally, it's more babies in specific families, and frankly often of a specific race or religious background. And that has been a component part of many pronatalist movements around the world. That is dangerous. It's a big part of the reason why, even though I support many pro-family policies, I really hedge at this term pronatalist. And it means that there's often great conservative hostility to women who are having children when they're not married or if they're partnered with other women. And so I guess I would say that I think one thing the conservative movement needs to do, if they do want to see birth rates tick up, is get used to single moms and figure out a way to support people who have children outside of a traditional family structure, and not treat that like it's some kind of second-rate, you know, oh, maybe we're gonna help you get married as a solution to that, but rather a completely legitimate way to have a child, and that many of the challenges that come with single parenthood are frankly socially inflicted, and there are ways to solve those challenges, gaps in, you know, things like income, child poverty rates. There are state solutions to those problems, and there are ways that we can support people in forming whatever kind of family works for them without having kids pay a price and without having women pay a price.
Further questions? Let's go right over here. Actually, let's have our guest.
Thank you. So my question is very brief, but I was wondering why you didn't address it in your speeches. And the main conflict between the two of you, to me, seems to be the gap between dream and reality. And wouldn't that be resolved by adoption? What is your take on that?
So adoption has, I often hear people that are anti-abortion or pro-life really kind of lean into adoption is kind of the way forward. The reality is adoption rates have radically decreased in the past several decades because the number of babies up for adoption has radically decreased. And that's not just because of abortion, it's also because of the question I was talking about earlier, which is the destigmatization of single motherhood. You know, around the world, there are not actually that many adoptable infants. You hear talking points from conservative and particularly Christian groups in the US that, you know, there's 1 million infants worldwide that need to be adopted. The reality is that most of those children do not actually have two parents who are dead. Most of those children have at least one living parent or extended kin who are willing to take them in. And you know, I think if you look at kind of your own life and your own communities, how many people do you know that if they had a child and then they died, there would be not a single person in their life who would take that child in, and that child would be placed into an adoption system? It's probably pretty low. And so this is just the reality of adoption. So in the US, there is a relatively small number of children up for adoption. Many of those children have profound disabilities that make potential parents essentially choose not to go the adoption route, right? Most parents who are seeking to adopt or potential parents seeking to adopt want healthy infants. And the number of healthy infants being born in the US who are placed for adoption is really, really low. There are not healthy infants in the US like languishing in orphanages for years and years, right? Right, also very expensive. And just honestly, like really, really not a particularly viable option is like a pure numbers game.
Yeah, I think that there are things that we can and should do to make it easier for people to adopt. I don't think the numbers are there for it to make a real dent in the gap that I've been talking about. Same is true of other things like IVF. Maybe there are different things that we ought to be doing, but the technological limits are still such that the numbers are just not going to be there for making a big difference in the kind of decline in the birth rate we've seen, or in the rise in the gap between actual and ideal birth rates as measured by what people say they want.
And I would also just add, obviously adoption can be a really incredible, beautiful thing. Adoption, though, often also starts with a tragedy, right? It starts with usually a woman who, for whatever reason, can't parent. And so to me, part of this calculus also has to be, how do we make a world in which more women who are carrying can decide whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term in the first place, and if they do decide to carry a pregnancy to term, don't feel coerced into placing a child for adoption, right? And for some women, it's a totally free choice, and it's like, I don't agree with abortion, I definitely can't have the kid right now, I'm going to place my child for adoption, and that is an incredible, awesome thing that we should facilitate. But for a lot of women, the calculus is a lot more complicated, and it's, I would like to raise this child, but I can't afford it, or I feel like I'm too young, or I'll get fired from my job, or I have an abusive husband or partner, or whatever it is. And so to me, a really important part of this is not just figuring out how do we facilitate more adoptions, but also how do we facilitate more women being able to parent the children that they want to have.
We can have a few more questions. Why don't we go in the back left?
I just like to kind of push back against the libertarian streak that's coming from both of you. So my question is also quite simple. It's very personal for me, is the ethical obligation that comes through old age, with old age for all of us. We're not always going to be healthy. One day we're going to be old. And the first time in my life when I realized I was a very strong pronatalist was when I saw my grandparents getting old. They were languishing in hospitals, in intensive care units, and people were taking care of them. So I was only 8 or 9 back then, so I asked myself, had they not had any children in their lives, what makes it, not that they should be simply deprived of health care in that scenario, but then in general, will it sit easy on their conscience that they're using the fruit of other families raising children, right, to take care of them when they're in incredibly difficult conditions, when they're kind of defecating all over the place, when like people need to take care of them 24/7. So that was when I realized, wow, if I want to be in a position when I'm 75, when I'm 80, and I'm there, other people are taking care of me on wheelchairs and stuff like that, and I want my conscience to rest easy on myself, that I'm not exploiting other people, the only logically consistent way for me to do that is I have to raise children myself. So I just want to know like how you would kind of respond to that sort of sentiment. Yeah.
I mean, so I would say part of living in a society is sharing in the help for other people, right? And so I don't have children. And if I do end up being in my 90s and needing other people to help care for me that are not my own progeny, part of how I justify that is, well, I've spent my life paying taxes into public schools, paying for school lunch programs, frankly wanting to be taxed at a higher rate so that I can, voting to be taxed at a higher rate for more support for children and families, using my professional platform to advocate for policies that I am unlikely to ever take advantage of, including universal childcare, paid parental leave, all of this stuff that helps kids and families and creates a stronger society. So I don't know if I'm 90 and in my wheelchair and there's somebody helping me out. To me, that is part of what a productive and good society does. You know, what I would add to that is that it's not just children who do the care work for elders, it's daughters. right? I mean, sons do it too to some degree, but when you look at the numbers of who is actually taking care of literally everyone, of children, of the elderly, of the sick, it's overwhelmingly women, and it's overwhelmingly daughters who are caring for aging parents. So to me, part of the requirement here is to also spread that care work around a little more equally, and also imbue it with more importance, more value, better pay, and greater dignity. And I think that's not going to happen if we keep it just a kind of purely, or not purely, but primarily female obligation. And it's definitely not going to happen if we keep it privatized within the family. The reality is, if we are lucky, most of us in this room will get old. At some point in our lives, if we are lucky, we will have a disability. At some point, we will need other people to help us do something basic, right? Again, if we are lucky to live into old age, this is probably what's going to happen. And so it makes sense to me to not make that a private obligation, something so universal, but rather to create a public system that, yes, of course, we can help our families and our communities and our friends, but also that this nearly universal experience for the lucky who live into old age is supported no matter what your family structure looks like.
So a couple things. A few years ago, there was some much touted research showing that parents are not as happy as non-parents when you correct for everything, demographic characteristics and so forth. More recent research has challenged that. But the thing that I thought was just too myopic. You need to compare grandparents to non-grandparents, and you can't become a grandparent unless you become a parent first. And I suspect, although that research hasn't been done, that we all know what the answer would be as to whether grandparents are happier than non-grandparents. I don't think that very many people ever have kids on the theory that it's my social obligation. There may be some particular contexts, and maybe to some degree even Israel is one of them now. But I do think if you take that wider social point of view, that there is this broader public interest. So we used to have a system throughout the world where people had kids and the kids took care of them in old age, and there was no public provision of any sort. And there's problems in that case. What if you can't have kids? What if you don't have kids? What if your kids don't survive into adulthood and you're left alone and nobody's helping you? What if your kids just turn out to be ingrates and are just terrible kids? Or are indigent kids and they can't help you? And that's one of the reasons we created Social Security and then later Medicare, was to end that kind of problem. But we didn't fundamentally change the intergenerational bargain there, we just socialized it. It is still the case that every generation depends on the next generation making the sacrifices, sometimes career and financial sacrifices, to raise that next generation that will then provide for them. That's true even if you have government provision. And that is one of the reasons I think that we shouldn't just be indifferent to what's happening to birth rates.
We can maybe get a few more. Let's get over here. And then after this, probably one more.
Really making them work, crossing the audience every time.
Get those steps in.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that's been a source of curiosity for me is like the correlation between education and birth rates. So it's been shown that in places like sub-Saharan Africa, the number of years that a girl is in school is a very strong predictor of how many children they will have later in life. And even in the rich world, there's been a gap between fertility of uneducated women versus educated women for the longest time now. But what I find very interesting is that recently that trend seems to have changed in the rich world, at least, where there is sort of a small, modest increase in the birth rates among highly educated women, which seems so paradoxical, because you think that with the number of years spent in school, the amount of income that you forego in those years, right, should decrease the number of children that you expect to have later in life. And yet that gap has narrowed, if not reversed in some places. I was just wondering, why do you think that is? Is it a matter of the gap between desire and reality, for highly educated people being met, or is it just a matter of, well, it's now sort of a status symbol to have more children? Yeah.
When I've seen this, when I've seen references to this thing, it's kind of very early data. It's a very, very recent trend. It's not clear it's going to be sustained, but to the extent that it seems to be happening, the theory that I've seen being brooded about is that it's a COVID effect. It's a remote work effect. That that would be something where the most highly educated cohorts would find it more easy to combine work and family than previously, because you've got this sort of shock to the entire society that that enables more remote work. Not only enables it, but requires it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't actually seen that data, so now I'm going to go Google it as soon as this debate is over.
Yeah, but I would say that like this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It does predate COVID, though. Like, I think peer research surveys do indicate that in terms of both desire, like number of desired children, and also number of children actually born, like
Yeah.
there is that.
I mean, of course, partly it's going to be, like if you are in grad school through your late 20s or early 30s, you're probably going to have a very different set of plans, and you're going to see your family future a little differently than if you are somebody who gets out of college in your early 20s and you're no longer in school. So partly, I think part of it is almost a kind of a mechanical effect of at least the way we do education.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very hesitant to just make a totally wild guess based on data I haven't seen for what's causing a demographic change. But, based on what you've said, I do wonder, too, if a component part of this might be fertility medicine. That the number of children born because of fertility treatments is ticking up pretty quickly every year. And the overwhelming majority of those kids are being born to women with at least college educations, right? I think I probably shouldn't quote a number I'm not sure of, but I think it's roughly 1 in 100 births, particularly in kind of liberal states, are now as the result of some fertility treatment, not necessarily IVF, but something kind of in that big umbrella. And one trend that we have seen very clearly is that age of first birth has been getting older and older and older among all demographics, right? So no matter what your education, the age that you on average have your first kid is going much higher, and is much, much higher among women who have college degrees and higher still among those with graduate degrees. So it makes sense to me that that cohort are going to be the ones that are more likely to be using fertility treatments, and as fertility medicine improves, you're going to have more of those women who are having successful pregnancies. That is my completely made up, based on nothing guess.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We can't get any more audience questions, but now we can transition into closing remarks. Ramesh, you can start.
Sure. Well, I think we found some common ground here, although we still have some disagreements. I just go back to the point that we live in a society where something or some things are impeding people's ability to have as many kids as they want. And that ought to be something that is not the exclusive focus of our politics by any means, or our policy, but something that's on the agenda, something that we are tackling. And in many cases, I think it's going to involve maybe paying a little bit more attention to some issues that we already are thinking about but aren't thinking about enough. I mentioned housing as one of them, but I do think it's a profound one, where you've seen, particularly in some regions of the country, some serious problems with affordable housing that are then spilling over to all kinds of other things like mobility across our country, regional divergences in economic growth of a kind that we didn't used to have. Our higher education system, speaking here at a university, I think that has a lot to do with the way people structure their families, and particularly in the upper middle class. And maybe there are things that we ought to be doing differently there, whether in making higher education less expensive or making it less the exclusive pathway to economic opportunity that it's become in our society. I think that the more seriously we take this issue, the more seriously we're going to take a bunch of other issues that we need to address, and the better society that we will be.
Great. So to me, the big question is, what's the actual goal here? Is the goal simply more babies? And then, well, why is that the goal? Or is the goal more young people who can support economic growth, put money back into Social Security coffers, support the elderly into old age. If that latter list is the goal, there are a lot of ways we can achieve that, right? There are a lot of, immigration is one of them, but there are other creative ways that we can make sure that we have a country that is economically viable, that supports the elderly, that continues to invest in a social safety net that is not just contingent on women who are already in the US having more babies. I think there is a tremendous danger in putting the onus on future support of the elderly, of Social Security, of the future of a country's economy on the bodies of women and on reproduction. To me, a better question is, well, what's the point? What's the point of a society? What's the point of us being here? Societies, our political landscapes, our economies, they're what we make them. These are human invented things, right? They were not just like dropped on us by God above. And so when we think about what kind of society we want to live in, what kind of society we want to make, to me it comes down to how do we create a landscape in which individuals not only have a wide range of choices, but kind of outside of this like consumer political model, how do we create a society in which people are able to find not just happiness, but meaning, connection, and purpose in their lives? And a lot of that does often come from family. Historically, that has often come, particularly for women, in the role of motherhood and having children. But it's not the only way to find those things. It is one way, and we should therefore have public policy that enables families to make the choice to have children, enables individuals to make the choice to have children. But I think we should also be thinking more creatively. What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to have connection with other human beings? What does it mean to nurture other people and be nurtured in return? Are there ways to do that outside of a traditional family structure with a male breadwinner and a female caregiver? These, to me, are questions that kind of go beyond this like pro-natalist, anti-natalist framework, and I think are frankly more important in structuring a public policy landscape, and are also more important in just the basic cultural conversations, kind of more what we're doing here today, around what is the purpose of family? What is the purpose of a society? What is the purpose of politics? And I think if we lead with that, how do we make a world in which individuals are better able to find the things that we know make up a good life? Pursuit of knowledge, some connection with other human beings, ties to community, and ties to family and kin, whatever that looks like. If we prioritize those things, I think we're going to wind up with a much better outcome than simply strategizing ways for women to have more kids.
With that, why don't we give our guests a round of applause? Thank you very much.
Thank you.